Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. We start now with the questions of normal structure and function in the nervous system. 55-year-old man comes to the office due to progressive headaches over the past 2 months. The headaches are throbbing, often associated with nausea, and worsen when the patient coughs or bears down during a bowel movement. MRI of the brain with gadolinium reveals cystic mass as shown in this picture. Which of the following findings is most likely to be seen on physical examination of this patient? One of the things, ya shabab, that will come a lot in the nervous system is the symptom of headache. And headache, in a lot of cases that we are going to see in the questions, is related to increased intracranial pressure. We talked about the intracranial pressure, which is created by the cerebrospinal fluid that is surrounding the brain and the spinal cord. If there is a tumor or space occupying lesion that will cause compression and bulging of that tumor, compressing the fluid and increasing the intracranial pressure, that will cause headache. So one of the causes of headache is increased intracranial pressure. And important cause of increased intracranial pressure to consider is brain tumor or space occupying lesion. We see in this MRI a brain MRI with cystic mass, and there is always, we need to compare the right and the left to see if there is any difference. If there is any difference, we will consider that as abnormal. And look here at this hyperdense area, and then surrounded by this edema and cysts. So the question is related to a mass in this structure in the brain. And we are going to talk about details of this, Shabab, in the next few minutes. Before we answer the question, just let us discuss the motor system. So here you will find a good tutorial about headache of increased intracranial pressure. Of course, headache is a wide topic. There are many causes, but here is just concentrating with you about the increased intracranial pressure. So we need to know, ya shabab, what are the organs and what is the structure and what are the pathways that are involved in the motor system. We talked about the central nervous system in general, and we mentioned that we have sensory and we have motor. We talked about the motor as the efferent or effector. So we have an input usually from receptors that will ascend to the central nervous system, and then there is a response to that in form of motor or effector. And we talked about the motor. Part of it is the autonomic, and also we have the somatic, which is the voluntary, and here the autonomic is involuntary. So now if we take this branch of the nervous system, the motor, and concentrate on the somatic part, which is the voluntary part. So what are the centers and how we move our muscles voluntarily and in a well-organized manner? You know, it is not only a matter of having a voluntary activity, but this voluntary activity in normal adult, in normal human, need to be very organized. We don't know about the complexity actually of this movement because we are not aware about the different pathways and the different structures in the brain that are required to perform these single functions, but it is really complicated. So just to start, Shabab, let us focus and let us say somebody is walking, okay? So just forgive me about the drawing. I'm not very well drawing, but if we are moving our legs, ya Shabab, to walk, of course we need muscle, right? And this muscle should receive an impulse from a nerve. And here, between a nerve and muscle, we have neuromuscular junction. So the nerve is carrying an action potential, depolarization and repolarization to the muscle, asking these muscles of walking to contract. This is a peripheral nerve. Motor. This peripheral nerve is coming from the spinal cord. So the spinal cord has some tracts, axons, that are bringing the order of the contraction and the voluntary activity from actually a place in the brain called the motor cortex. And we are going to see the exact position and the exact site of the motor cortex in the brain. So if this is the brain, we have a place in the brain called the motor cortex that provide the initial impulse and the initial order that is going to be transmitted via the spinal cord into the peripheral nerve and finally in the muscle to contract. So you could see here some of the important structures. We have the motor cortex, we have the spinal cord, we have the neuromuscular junction, we have the peripheral nerve, and we have the muscle. That is not the end of the issue. There are other centers, because if you are moving your leg, what will tell your foot to stand on a specific position? There are, and what's your feeling about the plan of the next step? It is very organized movement. In order to have that, there are receptors. There are receptors in the muscles and in the joints. And these receptors are called proprioception. Proprioceptors. And also vibratory and pressure. the receptors, ya shabab, are not only for pain. We know we have a pain receptors because we feel pain, we feel a touch, but there are receptors in the muscles, in the joints, that tell how much stretches is the muscle. What is the relation of the leg and the special organ, the limbs? What is the relation of that in the space? Where is the position of that limb in the space? Is it close to the earth? Is it upward? Is it in between? So the specific movement, which is very smooth, require proper and normal functioning of these kind of receptors that are present in the muscles, present in the joint, the proprioceptors, the vibratory and pressure sensations. Okay, so we also need these receptors to tell us where is our limb in the space. And these are going to be transported again through a peripheral nerve in case it is in this case now it is sensory. Also ascend via a spinal cord. There are tracts in the spinal cord, sensory tracts, that collect the information and transmit it to the brain. And now we talked before about a center in the brain known as the thalamus. The thalamus will determine which information will need to go to the brain. And now it will come here in the brain, exactly in the sensory center. So the sensory center, ya shabab, is not working independent, and the motor system is not working independent. It is an integration. It is collaboration between both. So all the sensations, these kind of sensation, will arrive to the thalamus, which will send some of it, which is important for the movement, for the walking in this case, and required for integrated movement. And of course, the sensory system will provide the information to the motor system in order to perform in the right way. So there is a connection and integration. So we know now some of the more additional information. But not only that, there are two important centers in the brain. One of them is the cerebellum, and another one present in the brain called the basal ganglia. These two structures are important for movement and for the motor system. We know they are important because if there is a disease that affects the cerebellum, or if there is a disease that affects the basal ganglia, the patient develops motor symptoms. What these organs do, they coordinate. Especially we are talking here about the cerebellum, its function is to coordinate the movement. So it communicates with the motor center in the brain to have coordinated movement. What is coordination? It means many things, especially it means how rapid is the movement, how precise is the movement. These are important cerebellar functions. Okay, the basal ganglia is also important for the speed of activity, and also for gross movement, for the gross, because there are fine movements and there are gross movement. تمام يا شباب. I hope we try to make it simple. So we need a nerve, we need a muscle, neuromuscular junction. I'm telling all of that because there are diseases in each part of this. Maybe there is a disease in the nerve, maybe a disease in the neuromuscular junction, or in the muscle itself, or the peripheral nerve, or proprioception, etc. So even the tracts of the spinal cord. So we understand at least now that if there is a motor dysfunction, it might be from different levels, okay? It might be from different areas, either in the brain, in the peripheral tissues, in the muscle itself, in the proprioception, or in the thalamus, or even in the basal ganglia or the cerebellum. Maybe this figure, ya shabab, summarize the things that we talked about it. So we mentioned we have at the end the muscle fiber that need to contract. But when the muscle is contracting, there are receptors in the muscles, the muscle spindle, tendon organs, and other receptors, proprioception, vibration. All these receptors are monitoring the muscle contraction. So when the muscle is contracted, the movement, where is the muscle is going, where is these muscles are taking the limb, is it going to the right, is it going to the left, how is the gravity, how is the tension in the muscle. All these sensations are transmitted by special receptors that are found in the muscles and the joints. So all these sensations are working while the muscle is moving. While the muscle is moving, these receptors are giving information to the central nervous system. So the central nervous system will determine the next movement, where it should go. It should go change, it could go the same, where we want to direct the limb. Okay, so these are all transmitted by spinal cord up to the thalamus, which is, we mentioned that it is the gate to the cerebral cortex, and the thalamus will communicate the information to the motor cortex. And the motor cortex is also receiving information from another center called the premotor cortex, which also is like the king of everything. It is monitoring, it is telling the exact movement where it should go. So the motor cortex then will, you could see that the communication of the motor cortex, and by the way, this is a bidirectional. It is not only unidirectional, because the motor cortex will give information to the basal ganglia about the next movement. It will tell the cerebellum also, and the cerebellum will get back to the motor cortex to organize. Same thing for the basal ganglia. It communicates to the cerebellum, it communicates to the thalamus, and also there are the brain stem. Actually, the function of the brain stem, we mentioned that the brain stem is the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla. These organs that are in between the cerebral cortex and the spinal cord, first they carry these fibers. So the fibers that are the motor fibers coming from the cerebral motor cortex, they descend through the brain stem. So if there is a lesion, if there is an ischemia, if there is a disease that affects the brain stem, these tracts can be affected, and that will be reflected in the movement. So the brain stem is also important, and also the brain stem is the origin of the cranial nerves, as we are going to see next. These cranial nerves are similar to the peripheral nerves to the muscle, but these cranial nerves are the nerves that control the head and neck, sensory and motor. So, and after that, all these impulses coming from the motor cortex, after all the processing issues that are happening in these centers, they will descend to the to the peripheral nerve through the spinal cord until they reach the muscle again. One of the things that you will see in physical examination of the motor system, and we are talking all of this to understand and to integrate the function of the cerebellum, which has a lesion here, and this patient will develop a special kind of symptoms and signs due to the disease in the cerebellum. But now the cerebellum is part of the large motor system, which include a lot of centers. And when we examine the motor functions of the central nervous system, we have different things. We will need to examine the muscle, because we say that the muscle, of course, is the contracting unit. It is the one that will move the limb. So we have the muscle. And then we have tone and power that I'm going to tell you about them in just a few minutes. And we have the coordination. Coordination, this part of the motor system, is mainly the function of the cerebellum, coordination. And we do the examination for coordination by rapid alternative movements. So this movement, which is rapid and alternative, is a function of the cerebellum. If you have a disease in the cerebellum, we will not be able to perform these functions, okay? In addition to that, the finger nose, we will ask the patient to touch the finger of the examiner and then touch his nose. If there is a patient with cerebellar disease, he will not be able to exactly touch the nose. Maybe he will point the finger like that, or not exactly touching the nose. These fine movements, which is well coordinated, is a function of the cerebellum. So we have that finger nose test. We have leg heel chin test. If this is the shin of the leg, we'll ask the patient to put the heel and move it downward until touching the heel, okay, of the other leg. So this is the heel of the right leg, and this is the shin, and then we ask the patient to move it very slowly until touching the shin. This particular movements, and similar ones, of course, this is just a way to demonstrate the function of the cerebellum. These fine movements and coordinated movement is function of the cerebellum. So we have point-to-point movement, and we have rapid alternative movement, either hands or index thumb. Also, this movement is a function of the cerebellum, rapid alternative movement. Also, we have the gait, and cerebellum is also important for the gait as well as other centers. Here is also part of the motor, which is the deep tender reflexes, but this is something more related to the spinal cord. And another thing that we just need to know, because also it's part of the motor, are the reflexes. Actually, ya shabab, if we have, for example, the knee, this is the leg, and we have the knee joint here. One of the things that happen, maybe you see that in examination, if we touch by hammer this point, the leg is going to move involuntarily. This is called knee jerk. Or patellar reflex or knee reflex. Why there is a movement without involuntary? There is a tendon here, and you should know that the tendon is the end of the muscle. So the muscle is ending in tendons, and the tendon is inserted into the bone. Okay, if this is a bone, for example, this is the tibial bone, and we have a muscle. Let's draw that bone like that. If this is a bone and we have a muscle, the end of the muscle, which is attached and anchored in the bone, is the tendon. And here is another tendon. These tendons contain receptors. There are receptors here. So when we touch by the hammer the tendon which contain these receptors, the impulse will be transmitted to the spinal cord, and there will be a direct neuron here that will tell immediately the muscle to contract. So these spinal reflexes the impulse the contraction of the muscle here is not from the central nervous system, is not from the cerebral motor cortex. It is only a response to the stimulus. The stimulus here is the sensation in the tendon and immediate reflex. Okay? So this is created for protection. Subhanallah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't want to injure the muscle, for example. If there is an immediate touch and immediate stretch of the muscle, there should be contraction immediately. It is a kind of protection. So it doesn't need to go to the central nervous system for all those processing issues that are happening in the central nervous system. If there is a quick stretch of the tendon, it needs to contract the muscle. Okay? So this is called a spinal reflex. However, the function of the central nervous system in these reflexes is inhibitory. So in order not to have the reflexes exaggerated or working all the time, just to suppress them, there is a negative impulses that are usually coming from the central nervous system that suppress the spinal reflexes. So the knee jerk is just, if we stimulate it, it will just be normal. It will not be high and increase. That's why we understand, ya shabab, we have sometimes a lesion in the spinal cord or lesion in the upper motor neuron, they call it, in the areas in the central nervous system, the spinal cord or above. If we lose this negativity due to an injury, there will be exaggerated reflexes. Exaggerated. So the spinal reflexes will increase. If we touch the patella, there will be brisk reflex. They call it brisk reflex. I am writing all the words that you could hear in the clinical. Brisk reflexes or hyperreflexia. So the central nervous system has no direct effect on the reflexes, but it has an inhibitory reflexes. Okay, so if we lose that, we will develop hyperreflexia. On the other hand, Suppose we have a lesion in the peripheral nerves, cut in the peripheral nerves, there will be loss of the reflex. It's called areflexia. Because we cut the sensory and we cut the motor, how the reflex will happen. The reflex, in order for the reflex to happen, need to transmit the impulse all the way to the spinal cord, to the central and the spinal cord, and then get back via a motor that will tell the muscle to contract. So peripheral cut of the nerve will cause areflexia or loss of the reflexes. Okay? Another important application, Shabab, of this principle of the reflexes. If we have a lesion in the spinal cord, the distal part of the spinal cord will continue to work. It is working. There are neurons here. If there is a cut in the spinal cord upward, the reflexes will continue to work. There will be exaggerated reflexes, but the reflexes will continue. Okay? So this is another principle. So part of the motor examination is also the deep tender reflexes, and there is detail about that. There are different deep tender reflexes, the biceps, triceps, knee, and each one of these are carried by different kinds of nerves that are coming from the spinal cord from different levels, and clinically examining these reflexes will help us to determine which level in the spinal cord is diseased. And also, of course, we know about the gait and the power of the muscle, and the tone is similar to reflexes, but it is more detailed in the physical examination. We will come to it later when we have a disease that affects the tone. So watch with me here about the difference between a normal and a patient. This is rapid alternative movement, normal. Now look now. Okay. So this patient is not able to perform the rapid alternative movement, and this is called dysdiadochokinesia. Dysdiadochokinesia is due to cerebellar disease. Which of the following findings is most likely to be seen on physical examination of this patient? Left dysdiadochokinesia. Left. Why left? Because this patient, and we mentioned before, I hope you remember that if we have something on the image on the right side, that means it is in the left. Okay? So we have, in this patient, we have left lesion in the cerebellum. And usually the cerebellar lesion will cause the symptoms and signs in the same side of the lesion. And this is different from the brain. We are going to see details of the cerebral diseases and the spinal cord diseases. Most of the time, and in a lot of diseases, we have crossing of the fibers. So the fibers on the right side will cross to the opposite side. So if we have a lesion in the right side of the brain, the symptoms will appear on the left side. If we have a lesion on the left side, it will appear on the right side, opposite. However, exception is the cerebellum. If we have a lesion in the cerebellum in the right side, it is going to manifest on the right side. Left, left. Okay? And this patient is having an issue in the left cerebellum. Okay? The one in the right side of the image is in the left part of the cerebellum. That's why he has left dysdiadochokinesia. So his left hand will not be able to perform the rapid alternative movement, which is called dysdiadochokinesia. Here you will find, a nice video about different functions of the cerebellum. I'm not going to just to run the video now, but just I want you to focus, with me here in the anatomy of the cerebellum, because there is a central portion in the cerebellum called the vermis, and then there are two hemispheres on the right and on the left. So there is lateral hemisphere and there is intermediate hemisphere. So you could see that overall, all the functions of different parts of the cerebellum is related to motor. Okay, so here motor planning, motor execution, balance of eye movement. Eye movement is part of the movement. Eye movement is part of the movement. So any movement will involve the cerebellum. Okay, but one of the things that we will need to maybe more detail, in the cerebellar function that you are going to see in the video is that the vermis, which is the central portion of the cerebellum, is more related to the gross movement, the trunk muscles, the muscles on the trunk, which is more related to the balance. Okay. On the other hand, the hemispheres are related to the fibers that are related and function for the limbs. Okay. So if we have a disease that affect or a tumor that affect the hemisphere, the signs and symptoms, clinical features of the patient will be in the periphery, in the limbs. On the other hand, if we have a disease that affect the vermis, the issues in this patient will be in the truncal and in the balance, in the gait. Okay. So watch the video. It's nice to tell you about the different functions of the cerebellum. Look here with me in this figure. We talked about this kind of movement, which is the patient cannot move heel down chin. So we ask the patient to put the heel and then move it downward until touching the other heel. Patient with cerebellar disease will not be able to perform this activity. Also, there is the tremor. There is a tremor and it is action tremor. So what is tremor? Shaking of the hands. And there are mainly two kinds of the tremor. Shaking of the hands. We are talking here about the shaking of the hands. There is resting tremor. Let me talk about this in just 1 minute, because it will help later on to differentiate between. I'm not going to talk about everything about tremor, but just for now, two kinds of tremor, which is shaking of the hand. It can be action or intentional. And the other types is resting tremor. Resting, it means when the patient is resting and not moving, there will be spontaneous tremor. Okay, spontaneous tremor when the patient is resting. So this is called resting tremor. And this resting tremor is related mostly or a lot of times related to basal ganglia disease. And here in more specific, we are talking about Parkinson's disease. On the other hand, action tremor, which means when the patient start to move the hands, when he start to move the hand, there will be start of shaking, and then it becomes more and more as the patient is moving toward the target. And this is mainly related to cerebellar disease. So cerebellar disease, because the cerebellum is more function in the coordination of movement. Coordination of movement means there is a movement already, and now we want to coordinate the movement. So there will be an action tremor in the cerebellar disease. And these are two types of the tremors. Of course, there are multiple other causes. Just for now, you could know these two types. Action tremor, hand unsteady on attempting to hold glass. So the patient is already performing something and doing something, and then there will be start shaking. The other things that we could see here is the finger to nose test. Finger to nose, the patient will not be able to direct the finger accurately. Here we have the other issues, which is ataxia. Acute cerebellar lesion produce headache, nausea, vomiting, and vertigo, along with gait ataxia. And the gait ataxia, as we just mentioned, will be more related to a disease that affects the vermis. A vermis is not on the side, it is in the middle. I put this just to show you, ya shabab, the motor cortex, primary motor cortex, and show you the relationship and the different areas in the cerebrum. The cerebral cortex has different areas, and each area is function morely about specific parts. So we have here the premotor associated cortex. Primary motor cortex is here. And then we have other areas that are related to sensations. Of course, we mentioned in the introduction about the frontal lobe, occipital lobe, we have the temporal lobe, parietal, most about related to the sensation, somatosensory. And another thing we could see here in the primary motor center, each part of it is more related to a particular area in the body. So for example, look at there are a lot of neurons that are covering the hand, because we have very fine and detailed movement of the hand. So the representation of the movement of the hand is large in the brain, okay? And that is compared, for example, to very small area for the legs, for example. The foot has not as much neurons as the hand. Hand has very detailed activities, while the foot maybe not that much. Just each part of the motor cortex is related to particular area in the brain. And that also includes the face and the other part of the. So here we have, just to memorize ya shabab, the symptoms and clinical features of cerebellar. Let us write it down here. Cerebellar disease was dysfunction or tumor, like in this patient, or cystic lesion, hemangioblastoma that we are going to see, intention tremor, dysdiadochokinesia, forgive me about the spelling, ataxia, lesion, hemangioblastoma. Look at the picture here about another picture of hemangioblastoma, which is a tumor that can affect the cerebellum, and that will cause also a cystic lesion. These are different pictures that you could see about hemangioblastoma. Lesion, affecting the left cerebellar hemisphere, which is a center for motor coordination of ipsilateral. Ipsilateral means the same side, right, left, left. Contralateral, the opposite. So here the left cerebellar hemisphere, which control and help motor coordination of the ipsilateral extremities, cause left dysdiadochokinesia, limb dysmetria, which is overshooting at the target movement, and intentional tremor. Here it doesn't mention about the ataxia and gait because it is mentioning to you it is a hemisphere. Okay, if the issue is in the vermis, that will cause ataxia.